the Viking invasion of the Islamic world. In the summer of 859, 62 square sails tore across the Atlantic horizon, stained red like dried blood under the sun. The fleet had departed from the Loire River with a single objective: to sack Rome, the eternal city, the heart of Christendom. At the helm sailed two men whose names already made Europe tremble: Björn Ironside and Hastein the Cunning. They had burned Paris, they had subdued kings, and now they pointed their prows southward where no Norseman had ever dared to go. But what they found was not the glory of Rome. It was something no Viking expected. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow cleft between two worlds, and entered the Mediterranean like hungry wolves among an unprotected flock, and then they veered south, toward Africa, toward the heart of Islam. On the coasts of Morocco, the city of Nekor slept under the desert sun. A Berber jewel nestled in the Rif Mountains, founded 2 centuries earlier by the very founder of Morocco. Its inhabitants had never seen a man from the north. They had never heard of the Magus, the fire worshippers, as the Arabs called those barbarians with wheat-colored hair. And then the sea filled with dragons. Red sails emerged from the morning mist. Oak hulls cut through the waves like blades. And before the guards could sound the alarm, the first warriors leaped onto the sand with axes raised high. What followed lasted 8 days. 8 days of fire, blood, and terror. Screams echoed through the stone alleyways. Mosques were desecrated. Women were torn from their homes, including the governor's own daughters, princesses who would be sold as slaves in the frozen markets of Ireland. And when the ships finally departed, laden with gold, silk, and captives, Nekor lay in silence. An open wound in the pride of the Islamic world. But this was not the first time the Magus had attacked, and Islam had already learned to strike back. 15 years earlier, in 844, a letter arrived in Cordoba carrying words that would freeze the blood of any ruler. The sender was Wabala ibn Hazm, governor of Lisbon. The message was simple and terrible. Strange ships had been spotted off the coast, dozens of them. Perhaps 70, perhaps 100. Their sails covered the horizon like red birds of ill omen. The men aboard were giants with light hair and eyes blue as ice. They carried war axes and knew no mercy. The Emirate of Cordoba was at that time one of the most advanced civilizations on earth. While Christian Europe still stumbled in the darkness of ignorance, Al-Andalus shone. Its libraries held the knowledge of Greeks and Romans. Its physicians cured diseases that others called divine curses. Its poets sang verses that made kings weep. Cordoba was light in a world of shadows, and its emir, Abd ar-Rahman II, ruled with a firm hand a kingdom that stretched from the Pyrenees Mountains to the Atlantic coasts of Portugal. But even light cast shadows. And from the shadows of the north came the Vikings. They had departed from their base on the island of Noirmoutier in the Loire estuary. For decades, the Norse had used that point as a springboard for their attacks on France. From there, their fleets glided down the Seine, the Garonne, the Loire, sacking monasteries, burning villages, demanding tribute from terrified kings. Europe had learned to fear the sound of their drums and the gleam of their axes, but no one imagined they would venture so far. The fleet descended along the Atlantic coast like a serpent of wood and iron. First, they attacked Asturias, the Christian kingdom in northern Spain. King Ramiro I gathered his forces and confronted them at the Tower of Hercules in A Coruña. The battle was brutal. The Vikings suffered significant losses, but they did not surrender. They simply changed course. If the north was too strong, they would go south, toward the lands of Islam. Lisbon was the first to fall. For 13 days, the Magus occupied the Muslim city. 13 days of methodical plunder, 13 days of calculated terror. The inhabitants who did not flee were killed or enslaved. The mosques were looted. And when the ships departed loaded with spoils, they left behind a traumatized city and a desperate governor writing urgent letters to Cordoba. From Lisbon, the fleet continued south, Cadiz, Medina Sidonia, Algeciras. One by one, the coastal cities fell like dominoes. The Vikings had discovered something that would change their strategy forever. The Islamic world was rich, incredibly rich. Its cities overflowed with gold, silk, spices, and valuable slaves, and its coastal defenses, accustomed to threats from the Mediterranean, were unprepared for invaders arriving from the Atlantic. On the 25th of September, 844, the inhabitants of Seville awoke to a vision they would never forget. Emerging from the morning mist over the Guadalquivir River, 54 warships glided in deadly silence. Their square sails hung slack in the light breeze. Their black hulls reflected the golden light of dawn. And on each prow, dragon figures carved in wood seemed to smile with iron teeth. Seville was one of the jewels of Al-Andalus. Its great mosque, recently built by order of the emir himself, stood majestically over the urban landscape. Its markets bustled with merchants from 3 continents. Its stone streets echoed with the sound of Arabic poetry and Andalusian music. It was a city of culture, of faith, of pride, and it was about to know hell. The Vikings established their base on Isla Menor, a defensible island in the marshes of the Guadalquivir. From there, they launched their attacks with surgical precision. On the 29th of September, a local force attempted to dislodge them. It was massacred. On the 1st of October, after a brief siege and fierce combat, the gates of Seville yielded. And then, the horror began. Muslim chroniclers described what followed with words that still cause chills today. The inhabitants received the terrors of captivity or death. Not even the beasts of burden were spared. The Vikings plundered house by house, street by street. They loaded gold, silver, precious fabrics, weapons, anything that could be sold or melted. And they took people, men to be sold as slaves, women for even worse fates, children torn from their mothers' arms. They tried to burn the great mosque. The flames licked its walls, but by some miracle, or perhaps due to the quality of Muslim construction, the building did not collapse. The survivors saw in this the hand of God. The invaders saw only another obstacle to overcome. But while Seville bled, a response was being prepared. When news of the fall of Seville reached Cordoba, Emir Abd ar-Rahman II wasted no time with lamentations. He was a man of action, a ruler who understood that empires are built not only with poetry and philosophy, but with steel and blood. Immediately, he summoned his Hajib, Isa ibn Shuhaid, the chief minister of the emirate. The orders were clear: gather all available forces, crush the invaders, recover Seville. Messengers galloped to all the provinces. The governors received unequivocal orders: send your men, all of them, now. The military machinery of Al-Andalus, lulled by years of relative peace, awoke with a fury that would surprise even the Vikings. A particularly important contingent came from the north. Musa ibn Musa al-Qasi was the leader of the Banu Qasi, a semi-independent principality that frequently rivaled Cordoba. In normal times, he and Abd ar-Rahman were political adversaries. But these were not normal times. Facing the threat of the Majus, old rivalries were set aside. Musa marched south with his warriors, joining the emir's army in a demonstration of unity the Vikings would never have anticipated. The Muslim army gathered at Aksarafe, a strategic hill near Seville. From there, Isa ibn Shuhaid could observe the occupied city and plan its reconquest. The Vikings had made a fatal error. They underestimated their adversaries. Accustomed to facing the fragmented Christian kingdoms of the north, they expected to find the same disorganized chaos in the south. Instead, they encountered a coordinated, disciplined, and furious empire. In the following days, the two forces clashed in a series of skirmishes. The results were mixed. The Vikings were formidable warriors, trained from childhood in the art of war. They fought with a ferocity that bewildered the Muslims. But there was a fundamental problem. The Norse were on foot. Their famous ships were useless on land, and the Muslims had cavalry. The light cavalry of Al-Andalus was legendary. Mounted on fast and resilient Arabian horses, Muslim riders could attack, retreat, and attack again before the heavily armed Vikings could even raise their shields. It was a form of warfare for which the men of the north were unprepared. Gradually, the tide began to turn. The decisive blow came on the 11th or 17th of November at a place called Taliata, near the ruins of ancient Roman Italica. The Muslim army finally cornered the main Viking force, and then it unleashed hell. Arab chroniclers describe catapults hurling incendiary projectiles at the anchored ships. Greek fire, the terrible flammable liquid that the Byzantines had used for centuries against their enemies, now consumed the Norse vessels. The flames leaped from ship to ship. The Guadalquivir River transformed into a corridor of fire. The screams of Vikings burning alive mingled with the roar of flames and the crackling of wood. 30 ships were destroyed that day. Between 500 and 1,000 Vikings perished. The fleet commanders were captured and executed. Their bodies hung from the palm trees of Seville as a warning to any other invader who dared dream of sacking Al-Andalus. The survivors fled downriver, pursued by Muslim cavalry. Some managed to reach their remaining ships and escape to sea. Others were not so lucky. They were hunted in the marshes and fields around Seville, killed one by one until none remained. Emir Abd al-Rahman II was not content with victory alone. He understood that the Vikings had revealed a fatal weakness in Al-Andalus's defenses. The Atlantic coast was unprotected. Immediately, he ordered the construction of a naval arsenal in Seville. Walls were erected around coastal cities. Troops were recruited and trained specifically for maritime defense. A network of messengers was established to quickly alert of any sighting of strange ships. And then something extraordinary occurred. The following year, the Vikings sent an embassy to Cordoba, not to threaten or demand tribute, but to negotiate peace. The fearsome Magus, who had made Christian Europe tremble for decades, were now asking terms from the Muslim emir. Abd al-Rahman II responded with a display of diplomatic sophistication that would leave the northern barbarians perplexed. He sent as ambassador a poet named Yahya ibn al-Hakam, known by his nickname Al-Ghazal, the Gazelle. For more than 20 months, Al-Ghazal lived among the Vikings, learning their customs, studying their society, even conversing with their queen about Islam and the Muslim world. It was a diplomatic mission that anticipated modern cultural exchanges by centuries, and it demonstrated something the Vikings rarely found in their victims: the capacity to treat them as equals, not as monsters. Some of the Vikings defeated in Seville chose a different path. Instead of fleeing, they stayed. They converted to Islam. They settled in the Guadalquivir Valley, where, according to later Arab sources, they became cattle herders and cheese producers. The terrible warriors of the north, the fire worshippers who had made Seville tremble, transformed into peaceful dairy merchants. It is one of the most delicious ironies of medieval history. But the story did not end in 844. 15 years later, the Vikings returned. The expedition of 859 was larger, more ambitious, and bolder than anything the Norse had attempted before. 62 vessels departed from the Loire under the command of Björn Ironside and Hastein. Their declared objective was nothing less than Rome, the eternal city, the spiritual heart of Christendom. But to get there, they would have to cross Muslim territory, and this time, Al-Andalus was prepared. When the fleet appeared off the Galician coast, it found fierce resistance. The Asturians, who had learned painful lessons in 844, repelled the invaders before they could even disembark. The Vikings veered south, seeking easier targets. They found Niebla, where Moorish forces stopped them again. They continued to Algeciras, where they finally achieved some success, burning the local mosque before being expelled. And then they did something no Viking had done before. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. That narrow strip of water, barely 14 kilometers separating Europe from Africa, was a portal to another world. On the European side, the mountains of Spain rose grey against the sky. On the African side, the coasts of Morocco gleamed under the desert sun. The Vikings slipped through that passage like ghosts, leaving behind the world they knew and entering completely unknown territory. The North African coast they found was dominated by Berbers, Amazigh peoples who had inhabited those lands since time immemorial. They had resisted Phoenicians, Romans, and Vandals. They had embraced Islam and transformed it into something uniquely their own, and now they faced a new type of invader. Nekor was the cultural capital of the Rif, the mountainous region that dominates northern Morocco. Founded by Idris ibn Salih more than a century earlier, it was a center of Berber civilization, a city of mosques, markets, and madrasas where Islamic knowledge flourished. Its inhabitants had never seen anything like the men who landed on their beaches that winter day. The Vikings attacked with their characteristic brutality. For 8 days, the city was systematically sacked. The chronicler al-Bakri, writing a century later, recorded that the Magus, may God curse them, invaded the small Moroccan state of Nekor and plundered it. They took all inhabitants as captives, except those who saved their lives by fleeing. Among the prisoners were Amma al-Rahman and Kanula, daughters of the local ruler, Berber princesses who would be taken to the frozen lands of the north as slaves. News of the sack of Nekor spread through the Islamic world like fire through dry straw. It was an unprecedented outrage. The barbarians of the north had dared to attack not only Al-Andalus, but Muslim Africa itself. Emir Muhammad of Cordoba, who had succeeded his father Abd ar-Rahman II, ordered the princesses rescued at any cost. Eventually, an agreement was reached, and the young women returned home, but the humiliation remained. Satisfied with their spoils, the Vikings departed from Nekor and sailed back through the Strait of Gibraltar, now carrying not only gold and silk, but also dark-skinned African captives whom the Norse called Blamen, blue men. Some of these prisoners would eventually reach Ireland, where recent archaeological evidence suggests their presence. A skull found in 2013 on the banks of the River Colne in England was dated to the late 9th century and identified as belonging to a woman of sub-Saharan African origin. She may have been a descendant of the Nekor captives brought through Viking slave routes that connected 3 continents. The expedition continued through the Mediterranean. The Vikings sacked Narbonne and Nimes in southern France. They established a winter camp in the Camargue, the swampy delta of the Rhône. The following spring, they sailed to Italy, where they captured Pisa and attacked Fiesole in the hills above Florence. And then came the most famous or infamous episode of the entire expedition. Hastein wanted Rome. He wanted to be the man who sacked the Eternal City, the center of the Christian world. But when the Viking fleet sighted a walled city on the Ligurian coast, it made a mistake that would become legendary. It confused the small city of Luna with Rome. What followed was one of the most colorful stories of the Viking Age. Unable to penetrate Luna's walls by force, the Norse resorted to cunning. Hastein pretended to be mortally ill. Messengers were sent to the city's bishop, imploring that the Viking chief be allowed a Christian conversion on his deathbed and burial in consecrated ground. The pious bishop agreed. A funeral procession entered through the city gates. Hastein's body was carried on a litter, covered by a shroud. Honor guards marched at his side, heads bowed in apparent mourning. And then, the moment the procession reached the city center, the corpse leaped from his litter with a sword in hand. The honor guards drew their hidden weapons. The gates were opened for the rest of the fleet. Luna was sacked. Hastings' disappointment upon discovering he had not conquered Rome was so great that, according to some sources, he ordered the massacre of the entire male population of the city. Truth or exaggeration, the story captures something essential about the Viking mentality: the insatiable hunger for glory and the fury at any obstacle. But the invaders' fortune was about to change. On the return voyage, while attempting to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar again, the Umayyad fleet awaited them. The navy that Abd ar-Rahman Sur had built after 844 was now ready for revenge. The encounter was devastating. Muslim catapults hurled Greek fire projectiles at the Viking ships. The wooden vessels, dried by the Mediterranean sun, ignited instantly. The strait transformed into a corridor of flames. 40 ships were lost to storms during the expedition. More ships were destroyed by Muslim fire off the coast of Medina Sidonia. When the survivors finally reached the Loire, only 20 of the original 62 vessels still floated. 2/3 of the fleet had been lost. Thousands of Vikings were dead, drowned, burned, or fallen in combat. The Great Mediterranean Expedition, which was supposed to bring eternal glory to Björn Ironside and Hastein, ended in disaster. The Vikings never returned to the Mediterranean in force. There were minor attempts, like the attacks of 966, but all were repelled by the defenses the Muslims had built. The Islamic world had learned to defend itself, and the Vikings had learned that not all their enemies were easy prey. The legacy of these encounters between Norse and Muslims is complex and fascinating. On one hand, the Viking raids caused immense destruction and suffering. Cities were sacked, lives were lost, people were enslaved. The trauma remained in collective memories for generations. On the other hand, these encounters forced both sides to recognize each other's existence in ways that went beyond simple violence. Al-Ghazal's diplomatic mission to the Vikings demonstrated that dialogue was possible even between radically different cultures. The Vikings who converted to Islam and settled in Al-Andalus proved that integration could occur, and the Arab coins found in Viking graves throughout Scandinavia attest to a trade network that connected the frozen fjords of the north with the sunny bazaars of the south. Modern archaeologists continue to discover evidence of these connections. In 2015, a ring found in a Viking tomb in Sweden revealed an inscription in ancient Arabic, "For Allah" or "to Allah." Dated to around 850, the ring may have belonged to a merchant, a slave, or perhaps even someone who knew Al-Ghazal during his diplomatic mission. It is a small object, but it tells a great story about a medieval world much more connected than we generally imagine. Muslim chroniclers who recorded these events left vivid descriptions of their Norse adversaries. They called them Majus, fire worshippers, a term originally used for Persian Zoroastrians that the Arabs adapted to describe any non-Abrahamic pagan. They described them as tall men with light hair, fierce warriors who knew no fear. But they also noted something more: their capacity for adaptation, their willingness to negotiate, their eventual openness to conversion. The historian Ibn al-Qutiyya, writing a century after the events, offered one of the most detailed descriptions of the attack on Seville. His words capture the terror of those days, but also the resilience of the Muslim response. The contrast he draws between the initial violence of the invaders and their eventual defeat serves as a parable about the limits of brute power when facing an organized civilization. Today, the waters of the Guadalquivir run as peacefully as they ever did. Seville has transformed into one of the great cities of modern Spain, its great mosque converted into a cathedral. Its walls long disappeared under urban expansion. Nekor is now an archaeological site near modern Bini Buayak, visited by tourists who rarely know its dramatic history. But the stories remain. In the archives of libraries from Madrid to Istanbul, the manuscripts of medieval chroniclers preserve memories of a time when warriors from the frozen north encountered the civilization of the sunny south. A time of violence and terror, yes, but also of mutual admiration, improbable diplomacy, surprising conversions, and connections that crossed oceans and continents. The Vikings who sailed to the Mediterranean and North Africa in the 9th century were the first of their people to see mosques and Moorish palaces, to taste dates and oranges, to hear the muezzin's call echoing from minarets. Some died in foreign lands, burned by Greek fire or killed by Andalusian swords. Others returned home, carrying treasures and stories that would seem fantastic to their compatriots' ears. And a few chose to stay, abandoning their fathers' gods for the god of Muhammad, trading axes for plows, transforming from invaders into neighbors. It is a story that defies the simplistic narratives we often tell about the past. There are no clear heroes or obvious villains. There are only human beings doing what human beings have always done: fighting, negotiating, adapting, surviving, and sometimes, against all odds, finding points of connection across chasms that seemed impassable. The echo of those raids still resonates today, in the libraries that preserve Arab manuscripts describing the Magus, in the genes of Andalusian families who may, unknowingly, descend from converted Vikings, in the trade routes the Norse helped establish between northern and southern Europe, and in the stories we tell about a time when the world was simultaneously larger and smaller than we imagine. Larger because distances seemed infinite and cultural differences insurmountable. Smaller because, even so, people from completely different worlds managed to meet, clash, and occasionally understand each other. The Vikings who attacked Al-Andalus and Morocco did not find the defenseless victims they expected. They found a civilization that rivaled theirs in courage, surpassed it in organization, and responded with a ferocity that made them rethink their strategies. The Islamic world of the 9th century was not an easy target. It was a formidable adversary. And when the dust settled and the flames died out, it was Islam that remained standing. Centuries later, when the Vikings' descendants became the Normans who would conquer Sicily and establish kingdoms on the edges of the Muslim world, perhaps they carried in their collective memories the stories of those first encounters. Stories of Greek fire illuminating the night, of Muslim cavalry charging across battlefields, of cities too rich to ignore and too well defended to conquer. The Viking invasion of the Islamic world was brief in the grand scheme of history. It lasted only a few decades, produced some battles, left some graves, but its significance transcends its scale. It was a moment when two worlds met at the edges of their spheres of influence, a moment that revealed both the ambitions and the limits of each. A moment that, however bloody it may have been, also planted seeds of contact and exchange that would flourish in unexpected ways in the centuries to come. And so, when we look at the Strait of Gibraltar today, we can imagine those red sails emerging from the Atlantic mist. We can hear the creak of oars and the beating of war drums. We can feel the fear of coastal inhabitants spotting the wooden dragons approaching, and we can remember that, more than 1,000 years ago, in those same waters, two worlds collided in a way that neither would ever forget. Greek fire illuminated the Mediterranean. Blood stained the waters of the Guadalquivir, and on the coasts of Morocco, an entire civilization discovered that no ocean was wide enough to protect it from the men of the north. But it also discovered something more important, that civilization, when organized and determined, can face any storm. The Vikings came as wolves, they left as survivors, and the Islamic world, wounded but undefeated, rose from the ashes stronger than before. That is the true lesson of those terrible and extraordinary days. It is not a story only of violence, though violence there was aplenty. It is a story of encounter between worlds, of adaptation under pressure, of human beings confronting the unknown and being transformed by it. It is the story of how terror can generate respect, how war can plant seeds of peace, and how even the fiercest conquerors can, in the end, choose to become neighbors. The Guadalquivir River still runs to the sea. The Rif Mountains still rise above the Mediterranean, and somewhere among the waves, the echoes of those encounters still whisper to those who know how to listen. A story of fire and iron, of faith and courage, of two worlds that clashed at the edges of the map and, in doing so, expanded the horizons of both forever.